It's strange how life can feel like a well-scripted movie, where every moment fits perfectly into place, the story unfolding just as you always imagined it would. That's how my life felt for the longest time. I met my wife, Hannah, when we were in 7th grade. She was the kind of girl who turned heads without even trying, the sort of person who made you feel like the sun shone a little brighter just because she was around. I couldn't believe my luck when she smiled at me during science class, her braces gleaming under the fluorescent lights. From that moment on, I was hooked. Our story was one of those rare high school romances that didn't just survive the trials of teenage drama, it thrived. We were inseparable. From prom nights to college applications, we tackled everything together. Everyone said we were destined to marry, and honestly, I believed it too. We got voted most likely to get married at our senior prom, and when I proposed during our junior year of college, it felt like the natural next step. We tied the knot right after graduation, a modest ceremony filled with friends, family, and promises of forever. 4 years into marriage, life seemed picture perfect. We had a beautiful 2-year-old son, Ethan, who was the light of our lives. Hannah had pursued her dream of becoming an engineer, while I carved out a career in pharmaceutical sales. Our schedules were hectic, but we always made time for each other. My mom lived just 5 minutes away, and she was a frequent visitor, doting on Ethan and offering us a helping hand whenever we needed it. My stepfather, Mark, was also a regular presence in our lives. He'd been married to my mom since I was 15, and though we didn't share a blood bond, he had become a father figure to me in every way that mattered. Mark was a towering man with a commanding presence. He'd been a basketball player in his youth, playing at a Division I college before spending a few years overseas. Though he never made it to the NBA, his stories of the court were the stuff of legend in our family. When he married my mom, he left that world behind and started a roofing business, which he still ran to this day. Despite his rugged exterior, he had a warmth that made him easy to trust. He treated my mom like a queen and always had a kind word for Hannah. Looking back now, I can't help but wonder if I was blind or just naive. I'm not a tall guy and I've always been a little self-conscious about it. I've kept myself in good shape over the years, hitting the gym regularly, but I've never been the athletic type. Mark, on the other hand, was everything I wasn't: tall, charismatic, and effortlessly confident. I'd be lying if I said I didn't admire him. He was the kind of man I'd always aspired to be, even if I knew I'd never quite measure up. Hannah had known Mark almost as long as I had. She'd been by my side through every family gathering, holiday dinner, and summer barbecue. Mark treated her like a daughter, always asking about her work and offering advice when she needed it. I never once thought to question their relationship. Why would I? Mark was married to my mom, and Hannah was my wife. The boundaries seemed clear, unshakable, even. Our life followed a predictable rhythm. Most days, I worked an 8 to 4 schedule, though my job often required me to stay late to close deals. Hannah's engineering job kept her busy, but she'd arranged her hours so she could spend evenings with Ethan. We'd settled into a comfortable routine, one that felt stable and secure. If there were cracks in the foundation, I didn't see them. Or maybe I just didn't want to. It was a Thursday afternoon when everything changed. I remember it vividly because it was one of those rare days when everything seemed to go right. By noon, I closed almost all my sales for the day, and my boss gave me the green light to head home early. I was excited at the prospect of spending a quiet afternoon with Hannah and Ethan. As I turned onto our street, I noticed Mark's car parked a few houses down from ours. At first, I thought he might be visiting a neighbor. It didn't seem unusual. Mark was friendly with just about everyone. I parked in the driveway and entered the house through the side door, the one that led directly into the kitchen. It was a habit of mine, a quicker way to get inside, and coincidentally, the one place we hadn't bothered installing a Ring camera. The house was quiet, but something felt off. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but the air seemed heavier somehow, charged with an energy that made my skin crawl. As I climbed the stairs, I heard noises coming from our bedroom. At first, I thought the TV was on, but the closer I got, the clearer it became that these weren't the sounds of a television show. My heart began to race. I told myself it was nothing, that I was overreacting, but a sinking feeling in my gut told me otherwise. When I reached the bedroom door, it was slightly ajar. I pushed it open, and the world as I knew it shattered into a million pieces. There, on our bed, was Hannah, my wife, the mother of my child, the woman I'd loved since I was 13. And with her was Mark, my stepfather, the man I'd looked up to for over a decade. They were so engrossed in each other that they didn't even notice me standing there. For what felt like an eternity, I stood frozen, my mind struggling to process what my eyes were seeing. Eventually, I found my voice. "What the hell is going on here?" I demanded, my voice cracking with a mix of anger and disbelief. They sprang apart, their faces a twisted mix of shock and guilt. Hannah scrambled to cover herself, stammering out excuses that only made the situation worse. Mark didn't say a word. He just stood there, looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. It wasn't shame. If anything, it was defiance. "I just needed something different," Hannah said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Those words hit me like a punch to the gut. Something different? After everything we'd been through, after all the love and trust we'd built, she needed something different. I didn't say another word. I couldn't. My throat felt like it was closing up, and my vision blurred with tears I refused to let fall. I turned and walked out of the room, out of the house, out of the life I thought was mine. As I drove aimlessly through the streets, my mind raced with questions I knew I'd never get answers to. How long had this been going on? How had I not seen it? And perhaps the most painful question of all, what was I supposed to do now? The perfect illusion was gone, shattered beyond repair. And all I could do was pick up the pieces and hope that somehow, someday, I'd be able to make sense of the wreckage. I don't remember much about how I got through the rest of that day. It's all a blur of rage, disbelief, and suffocating despair. When I finally pulled the car into a secluded spot at a nearby park, my hands were trembling so badly I couldn't even grip the steering wheel. I sat there for what felt like hours, staring out at nothing, trying to force myself to breathe. The betrayal was like a knife twisting in my gut. Hannah and Mark. My wife. My stepfather. Two people who should have been pillars in my life, who should have protected me, had instead taken a sledgehammer to everything I thought I knew. Every time I closed my eyes I saw them together, their faces etched with guilt and a sickening lack of remorse. Hannah's words kept echoing in my head, a cruel refrain that I couldn't escape. I just needed something different. What the hell did that even mean? Was I not enough? Was Ethan not enough? Had our entire life together been some kind of performance, a facade masking her dissatisfaction? And Mark, who had been like a father to me, who had been there for me when my own father couldn't be. How could he do this? How could he destroy the trust and respect we'd built over years without a second thought? I didn't go home that night. I couldn't. The thought of stepping back into that house, of facing Hannah and Mark, was unbearable. Instead, I checked into a cheap motel on the edge of town. The room smelled faintly of mildew, and the bed creaked with every movement, but it was a refuge, a place where I could shut out the world, even if only for a little while. I spent the night staring at the ceiling, my mind replaying the scene over and over, dissecting every moment, every word, every look. I wanted answers, but I wasn't sure I could handle them. Did it even matter how long it had been going on? Would knowing the details change anything? Would it make the betrayal any less devastating? By morning I knew I couldn't avoid them forever. As much as I wanted to run, to leave everything behind and never look back, I couldn't. Ethan needed me. He was the only thing that mattered now, the only anchor in the chaos my life had become. For his sake, I had to confront Hannah and Mark. I had to find some way to make sense of this nightmare. When I finally walked through the front door, the house felt different. The air was heavy, oppressive, as if the walls themselves were steeped in guilt and shame. Hannah was sitting on the couch, her eyes red and puffy from crying. She looked up when I entered, her face a mix of relief and apprehension. Mark was nowhere to be seen, and for that, I was grateful. I wasn't ready to face him yet. "We need to talk," I said, my voice cold and distant. I didn't wait for her to respond before heading to the dining table, gesturing for her to follow. She sat down across from me, fidgeting nervously with the hem of her sweater. For a moment neither of us spoke. The silence was deafening, filled with all the words we weren't saying. "How long?" I finally asked, my voice tight with barely contained anger. She hesitated, her eyes darting to the floor. 6 months, she admitted quietly. The words hit me like a physical blow, knocking the air from my lungs. 6 months? I repeated, my voice rising. 6 months, and you didn't think I deserved to know? You didn't think about what this would do to me? To Ethan? Tears streamed down her face, but I couldn't find it in myself to feel any sympathy. "I didn't mean for it to happen," she said, her voice breaking. I didn't plan this." "Oh, so it just magically happened?" I shot back, my anger boiling over. "You tripped and fell into my stepfather's bed? Don't insult me, Hannah. At least have the decency to own up to what you've done." She sobbed harder, but I didn't care. I couldn't care. Not anymore. "And Mark?" I demanded. "What the hell was he thinking? Does my mom know? Does she have any idea what kind of man she's married to?" Hannah shook her head. "No, she doesn't know. I begged him not to tell her. I didn't want to ruin her life too." Her words were like gasoline on the fire. "You didn't want to ruin her life?" I repeated incredulously. "What about mine, Hannah? What about Ethan's? Or does that not matter to you?" She didn't answer. She just sat there, crying and trembling, while I struggled to rein in my anger. I'd come here for answers, but all I'd found was more pain. The trust we'd built over a lifetime was gone, shattered beyond repair. And no matter what she said or did, it wasn't coming back. Eventually, I stood up. "I'm leaving," I said, my voice hollow. "I'll figure out what to do about Ethan, but as far as I'm concerned, we're done." She didn't try to stop me. She didn't say anything at all. As I walked out of the house, I felt a strange sense of relief mingled with the crushing weight of heartbreak. The life I'd known was over, but at least now, I could start figuring out how to pick up the pieces. The days that followed were a haze of pain and confusion. Staying at the motel became my temporary escape, but it wasn't long before I realized that running from the memories wasn't going to erase them. Every quiet moment was a minefield, each thought an ambush of despair. I found myself dissecting every detail of my life with Hannah and Mark, searching for signs I had missed, clues to the betrayal that had upended my world. Looking back, it was almost insulting how obvious some things seemed in hindsight. There was the way Hannah and Mark would share knowing glances at family gatherings, a silent exchange I'd always chalked up to mutual respect. There were the times when Hannah had stayed late after work, claiming deadlines or meetings, and Mark's seemingly coincidental drop-ins at our house during those times. I had dismissed it all as normal, unremarkable moments that carried no weight. But now, they loomed like glaring red flags, impossible to ignore. Even small comments took on new, sinister meanings. I remembered Mark joking once about how lucky I was to have such a catch as Hannah. At the time, it had felt like harmless banter. Now, it felt like a cruel taunt, as if he had been flaunting his betrayal right under my nose. My mind spiraled further as I considered the possibility that this affair wasn't just a momentary lapse in judgment, but something far deeper. 6 months, Hannah had said. But could I believe her? Could I trust anything she said after what she'd done? The more I thought about it, the more convinced I became that this had been going on for much longer. Years, maybe? The thought made my stomach churn. I started piecing together fragments of conversations, moments that had seemed inconsequential at the time. Like the Christmas 2 years ago, when Mark had given Hannah a bracelet, an expensive one that he claimed was a thank you for helping him with some work-related presentation. Or the summer barbecue where they'd spent an unusual amount of time talking in hushed tones by the grill. I had noticed it then but had brushed it off as idle chatter. Now, I wasn't so sure. The hardest part was realizing that the betrayal extended beyond just the physical act. It was the rewriting of my memories, the way the affair had tainted everything I had once held dear. The love I had for Hannah, the admiration I had for Mark, all of it felt like a lie. And with each memory that surfaced, my anger grew, fueled by the bitter sting of deception. Ethan was the only thing tethering me to some semblance of normalcy. Every time I saw his bright, innocent face, I was reminded of what truly mattered. But even that joy was tinged with darkness. Was I a fool to think I could shield him from the fallout of this disaster? Could I protect him from the inevitable questions, the truth that would one day come to light? Despite my anguish, I knew I couldn't avoid the confrontation any longer. The unanswered questions were a weight I couldn't carry indefinitely. And so, with a mix of dread and determination, I called Mark. His voice on the other end of the line was calm, almost indifferent. "We need to talk," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. "Face to face." There was a pause, then a sigh. "All right. Come by the shop tomorrow evening. We can talk then." I hung up without another word, my chest tight with anticipation. That night, I barely slept, my mind racing with all the things I wanted to say, all the accusations I wanted to hurl at him. By the time the next evening rolled around, I was a mess of frayed nerves and simmering rage. When I arrived at Mark's roofing business, the parking lot was nearly empty. The shop's overhead lights cast long shadows, giving the place an eerie, desolate feel. Mark was waiting for me inside, leaning casually against a workbench as if nothing was out of the ordinary. His nonchalance only fueled my anger. "How could you?" I demanded, my voice shaking with fury. "How could you do this to me? To my mom? To Ethan?" He didn't flinch. Instead, he crossed his arms over his chest and met my gaze with an infuriating calmness. "It wasn't about you," he said simply. "Or your mom." "Not about me?" I repeated, incredulous. "You slept with my wife, Mark. You betrayed your family. How the hell is that not about me?" He shrugged, as if the gravity of his actions didn't matter. "Things happen, kid. People get bored." "Bored?" The word felt like acid on my tongue. "That's your excuse? You ruined lives because you were bored?" His expression hardened, the veneer of calm slipping. "Don't act like your marriage was perfect," he said, his tone sharp. "You were always working late, always distracted. Maybe if you'd paid more attention, she wouldn't have looked elsewhere." The accusation hit me like a slap. For a moment, I was too stunned to speak. "You're blaming me?" I finally managed, my voice low and dangerous. "You're blaming me for your choices?" "I'm just saying it wasn't one-sided," he said. "You're not blameless in this." I wanted to hit him. The urge to lash out physically was almost overwhelming. But I knew it wouldn't solve anything. It wouldn't undo what he'd done. So instead, I turned and walked out, slamming the door behind me. The conversation left me seething, but it also gave me clarity. Mark's arrogance, his refusal to take responsibility, only solidified my decision to cut him out of my life completely. He wasn't worth my time or energy. My focus needed to be on Ethan, on building a future free from the shadows of betrayal. But there was still one more confrontation I couldn't avoid, my mother. Telling her the truth was the hardest thing I've ever had to do. Watching her face crumble as the weight of Mark's betrayal sank in was a pain I wouldn't wish on anyone. She wept openly, her sobs echoing in the quiet of her living room. "I thought he loved me," she whispered, her voice thick with heartbreak. "I'm so sorry, Mom," I said, my own voice breaking. "I wish I could take this pain away." She shook her head, wiping at her tears. "It's not your fault. None of this is your fault." Her words were a small comfort, but they didn't lessen the ache in my chest. In the end, all I could do was hold her as she cried, offering what little solace I could. As the days turned into weeks, the cracks beneath the surface continued to widen. The more I uncovered, the more I realized just how deeply the betrayal had seeped into every corner of my life. But even as the pain threatened to consume me, I knew I had to keep moving forward. For Ethan. For my mom. For myself. The confrontation with Mark had left me reeling, but it was only the first in a series of devastating encounters. The betrayal was too tangled and far-reaching to end with just him. Hannah, my mother, and even Ethan, all were caught in the web of deceit that Mark and Hannah had spun. I had no choice but to confront it all, piece by painful piece. The day I met with Hannah to discuss what came next, the air between us felt colder than it had ever been. We met at a quiet cafe, a far cry from the places we used to frequent as a couple. She was already seated when I arrived, her posture tense and defensive. I sat across from her, the table between us feeling like a chasm. "I need answers," I began, my voice steady but sharp. "How long, Hannah? How long have you and Mark been doing this behind my back?" She fidgeted with her hands, avoiding my gaze. "Does it matter?" she asked softly, her voice almost inaudible. "Of course it matters!" I snapped, slamming my hand on the table. Heads turned in our direction, but I didn't care. "Every detail matters because every detail shows me how long you've been lying. How long you've been throwing away everything we built." Her shoulders slumped, and finally, she met my eyes. 3 years, she admitted. "It started 3 years ago." The words hit me like a physical blow. 3 years. Longer than my son had been alive. Longer than I could have imagined. My stomach churned as I tried to grasp the enormity of it. "Why?" I asked, my voice breaking. "What was it about him?" "About me?" Hannah's lips trembled as she searched for an explanation. "It wasn't about you," she said finally. "It was me. I felt trapped, suffocated. Mark, he was different. He made me feel." "Don't," I interrupted, raising a hand. "Don't you dare try to justify this by saying he made you feel something I couldn't. You had a choice, Hannah, and you chose to betray me." Her tears spilled over, but I felt nothing but anger and disgust. "I'm filing for divorce," I said bluntly, standing up. "And I'm going for full custody of Ethan. You can't take him from me," she pleaded, her voice frantic. "He's my son too. You should have thought about that before," I said coldly before walking away, leaving her alone with her guilt. The confrontation with my mother was harder. I knew that revealing Mark's betrayal would shatter her world, but she deserved to know the truth. I invited her to my house, where I could control the environment and be there to support her. "What's going on?" she asked as she sat on the couch, her tone tinged with concern. "You sounded upset on the phone." I took a deep breath, sitting beside her. "Mom, there's no easy way to say this," I began. "But you need to know the truth about Mark." Her expression shifted to confusion, then fear. "What about him?" I hesitated for a moment, then plunged ahead. "He's been having an affair with Hannah." The color drained from her face, and she stared at me as though she hadn't heard correctly. "What did you say?" "For 3 years," I said, my voice cracking. "I caught them together. It's been going on behind our backs this whole time." She stood abruptly, her hand clutching her chest. "No," she whispered. "No, that can't be true. Mark, he wouldn't." I reached for her hand, but she pulled away, pacing the room as if trying to escape the weight of my words. "I'm so sorry, Mom," I said, tears welling up in my eyes. "I didn't want to hurt you, but you deserve to know." Her sobs filled the room as she sank into a chair, her body racked with grief. "I trusted him," she choked out. "I trusted him with everything. How could he do this to us? To you?" I sat beside her, holding her hand as we cried together. The betrayal wasn't just mine, it was hers too. In that moment, I realized that Mark hadn't just destroyed my marriage, he had shattered our entire family. The paternity test results were the final piece of the puzzle. Despite everything, a part of me feared what they might reveal. If Ethan wasn't mine, it would be another wound I wasn't sure I could survive. When the envelope arrived, my hands trembled as I opened it. I scanned the document, my eyes locking onto the words that mattered most: probability of paternity, 99.99%. Ethan was mine. Relief washed over me, but it was quickly followed by a renewed sense of determination. He was my son, and I would fight to protect him from the chaos his mother and Mark had created. I filed for divorce the next day, citing infidelity as the cause. I also began the process of seeking full custody, determined to give Ethan the stable, loving home he deserved. Therapy became a lifeline, helping me navigate the storm of emotions that threatened to consume me. Through it all, I clung to one truth: I couldn't control what had happened, but I could control what came next. Mark and Hannah had taken so much from me, but they couldn't take my future, or my son. The path forward wouldn't be easy, but it was mine to walk. And for the first time in months, I felt a glimmer of hope. The process of rebuilding my life felt like trying to piece together a shattered mirror, fragmented and jagged, but still reflecting something real. It wasn't about erasing the pain or forgetting what had happened. Instead, it was about reclaiming the pieces of myself that had been stolen, reshaping them into something stronger, something mine. The first step was leaving the home that had become a prison of memories. The house that once symbolized love and family now felt like a mausoleum, each room echoing with betrayal. I found a small, 2-bedroom apartment not far from my old neighborhood. It wasn't much, but it was mine. Ethan adjusted surprisingly well, his innocent laughter filling the empty spaces and giving me hope that, despite everything, we'd be okay. Moving day was bittersweet. I left behind not just a house, but also the life I thought I had. As I packed up my belongings, I found traces of the past everywhere: family photos, love letters from Hannah, gifts from Mark. Each discovery was a painful reminder of the lies that had unraveled my world. I threw most of it away, deciding that some things weren't worth keeping. Therapy became a cornerstone of my healing. At first, I was skeptical. What could a stranger possibly say to make this pain go away? But my therapist didn't try to fix me. Instead, she helped me understand that healing wasn't about erasing the pain. It was about learning to carry it differently. You were betrayed in the most profound way, she told me during one session. It's okay to feel angry, hurt, and lost. But those feelings don't have to define you. We worked through the layers of my grief: the anger at Hannah, the bitterness toward Mark, the self-doubt that made me question my worth. Slowly, I began to see that their actions weren't a reflection of me, but of their own flaws and choices. It wasn't my fault, and that realization became a turning point. One of the hardest parts of moving forward was co-parenting with Hannah. Our divorce proceedings were contentious, but we eventually reached a settlement. I retained primary custody of Ethan, with Hannah granted visitation rights. Each handoff was a test of my patience and composure, but I refused to let my anger overshadow my role as a father. Ethan was my anchor through it all. His bright eyes and boundless energy reminded me that, despite the chaos, there was still something pure and good in my life. I made it my mission to give him the stability he deserved. We established new routines, from bedtime stories to Saturday morning pancakes. Those small rituals became the foundation of our new life, a life built on love and trust. Mark's absence was a gaping void in my mother's life, but she showed a resilience I hadn't anticipated. She sold the house they'd shared and moved into a cozy condo closer to me. We leaned on each other in ways we never had before, finding strength in our shared grief. Our relationship deepened, and for that, I was grateful. Mark, on the other hand, disappeared. He left town shortly after the truth came out, unable to face the consequences of his actions. A part of me wanted closure, a confrontation that would allow me to say all the things I'd bottled up inside. But in time, I realized that his absence was closure enough. He didn't deserve space in my life or my thoughts. Months turned into a year, and the raw edges of my pain began to soften. I started reconnecting with old friends, taking up hobbies I'd abandoned long ago. I joined a local gym, not just to stay in shape, but to channel my anger and frustration into something productive. I even tried my hand at cooking, though my first few attempts were comically disastrous. As I rebuilt my life, I discovered a resilience I didn't know I had. The betrayal had broken me, but it hadn't destroyed me. I was still here, still standing, and that was something to be proud of. One evening, As Ethan and I were building a fort in the living room, he looked at me with a seriousness that caught me off guard. "Daddy," he said, "are you happy?" The question hit me harder than I expected. For a moment, I didn't know how to answer. But then I looked around at the life we'd created, simple, imperfect, but ours. And I realized that, in many ways, I was happy. Not the carefree happiness of my youth, but a deeper, more grounded contentment. "I am," I said, pulling him into a hug. "Because I have you." The scars of betrayal would always be there, a reminder of what I'd endured. But they no longer defined me. They were part of my story, not the whole of it. Life hadn't turned out the way I'd planned, but it was still mine to shape. As I tucked Ethan into bed that night, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't felt in a long time. The past was behind me, the future unwritten. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I was ready to embrace it. The journey wasn't over, but I was on my way. And that, I realized, was enough. Leave a comment with your thoughts on the story. And subscribe to our channel so you don't miss new interesting stories. See you soon.